Australia, a vast island continent, is known today for its beautiful landscapes, unique wildlife, and vibrant multicultural society. But the history of Australia is rich and complex, shaped by indigenous cultures, European exploration, and colonization. This history spans thousands of years and includes significant changes in its political, social, and cultural landscape. In this overview, we will explore Australia's history from its indigenous roots to its development into a modern nation. Before the arrival of Europeans, Australia was home to indigenous peoples who had lived on the continent for over 65,000 years. These indigenous Australians are made up of two main groups: the Aboriginal peoples and the Torres Strait Islanders. Aboriginal peoples lived across the mainland and Tasmania, while Torres Strait Islanders lived on the islands between northern Australia and Papua New Guinea. Each indigenous group had its own culture, language, and traditions, and their connection to the land was central to their way of life. They lived in a variety of environments, from deserts to rainforests, and their survival was based on hunting, fishing, and gathering. Indigenous Australians developed sophisticated knowledge of the land, plants, and animals, as well as tools and methods for surviving in often harsh conditions. Indigenous cultures were incredibly diverse, with more than 250 languages spoken before European arrival. Storytelling, art, music, and dance played important roles in preserving and passing down cultural knowledge. The Dreamtime, a set of spiritual beliefs and stories about creation and the land, is central to many Aboriginal cultures. The history of modern Australia begins with the arrival of Europeans. While the Dutch were the first Europeans to explore Australia's coast in the early 1600s, it was the British who would eventually settle there. In 1606, Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon became the first European to land on Australian soil, but he did not establish any permanent settlements. Over the next century, other Dutch explorers charted parts of the Australian coast, but they did not see the land as valuable for colonization. The real turning point came in 1770, when British explorer Captain James Cook sailed along the eastern coast of Australia. Cook mapped the coastline and claimed the land for Britain, naming it New South Wales. Cook's arrival marked the beginning of British interest in Australia, but it would be almost 2 decades before they would establish a colony there. In 1788, the British sent the first fleet to Australia, a group of 11 ships carrying convicts, soldiers, and officers. This fleet arrived at Botany Bay, near present-day Sydney, and the British decided to establish a penal colony. The colony at Sydney Cove, founded by Captain Arthur Phillip, was the first European settlement in Australia. The British used Australia primarily as a penal colony to send convicts who had committed crimes in Britain. Over the next few decades, more convicts were transported to Australia, and the population began to grow. While the early settlement was harsh, it gradually expanded with the introduction of agriculture, trade, and the development of towns. The early European settlers faced many challenges, including hostile relations with the indigenous population, who were forcibly displaced from their lands. Many indigenous people resisted British settlement, and conflicts occurred. These violent encounters, combined with the spread of European diseases, led to a significant decline in the indigenous population. As the penal colonies grew, the British expanded their settlements across the continent. By the early 19th century, new colonies were established in Tasmania, then known as Van Diemen's Land, Queensland, Western Australia, and South Australia. These colonies were initially set up to support agriculture, trade, and economic growth. While some colonies continued to be used for convict transportation, free settlers also began to arrive, drawn by the promise of land and opportunity. In the 1850s, the discovery of gold in New South Wales and Victoria led to a massive influx of immigrants. The gold rush attracted people from all over the world, including China and Europe. and it significantly boosted Australia's population and economy. However, this period also saw tension between different groups, including clashes between settlers and Indigenous peoples, as well as discrimination against non-European immigrants. The arrival of European settlers had a devastating impact on Indigenous Australians. The settlers brought diseases, such as smallpox, that decimated Indigenous populations, who had no immunity to these foreign diseases. As settlers expanded their territories, Indigenous people were forcibly removed from their lands, and their traditional ways of life were disrupted. In addition to the spread of disease, violent conflicts, known as the Frontier Wars, broke out between settlers and Indigenous groups. These wars were fought over land, resources, and cultural differences. Indigenous Australians fought to protect their land and way of life, but they were ultimately overwhelmed by the superior weaponry and numbers of the European settlers. By the late 19th century, Australia was made up of 6 British colonies: New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, and Western Australia. These colonies were self-governing, but they were still part of the British Empire. The idea of uniting these colonies into one nation began to take shape in the 1890s. In 1901, the colonies federated to form the Commonwealth of Australia, creating a single nation with its own government. The Australian Constitution was enacted, and Australia became a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. The country's first Prime Minister, Edmund Barton, took office, and Australia began to develop its identity as a nation. Although Australia became a unified country, it still retained close ties to Britain, which had influence over its foreign policy and legal system. Over the next few decades, Australia's relationship with Britain would change, especially as the country became more independent in its decision-making. Australia's involvement in World War I, 1914–1918, marked a significant moment in the country's development. As part of the British Empire, Australia entered the war alongside Britain and its allies. The war had a profound impact on Australia, with over 60,000 Australian soldiers losing their lives. The Battle of Gallipoli, in which Australian and New Zealand soldiers fought in a failed campaign to capture the Turkish peninsula, became a key moment in the formation of Australia's national identity. Australia's participation in World War II, 1939–1945, was also significant. The country fought alongside the Allies, and the war affected every aspect of life in Australia. The threat of Japanese expansion in the Pacific led Australia to seek closer ties with the United States, marking the beginning of a shift away from reliance on Britain. After World War II, Australia experienced a period of rapid growth and development. The country welcomed large numbers of immigrants from Europe, including displaced persons from war-torn countries. The government promoted the idea of building a better Australia by encouraging immigration, and the population grew rapidly. At the same time, social changes were taking place. The government began to dismantle the White Australia policy, which had restricted immigration from non-European countries, and Australia became a more multicultural society. This period also saw the rise of the civil rights movement, with Indigenous Australians demanding recognition and equal rights. In 1967, a historic referendum was held in which the Australian public voted overwhelmingly to include Indigenous Australians in the national census and allow the federal government to legislate on their behalf. This was a significant step forward in the recognition of Indigenous rights, but there was still much to be done. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, Indigenous Australians continued to fight for land rights, cultural recognition, and an apology for the injustices they had suffered. The Mabo Decision of 1992, which recognized the concept of native title, and the 1992 Redfern speech by Prime Minister Paul Keating, which acknowledged the wrongs done to Indigenous Australians, were significant milestones in the reconciliation process. Today, Australia is a thriving, multicultural nation with a strong economy and global influence. The country continues to address the challenges of its colonial past, particularly in terms of Indigenous rights and recognition. Australia's history is complex and multifaceted, but it is also a story of resilience, growth, and change. Australia's history is one of both tragedy and triumph. From its ancient Indigenous cultures to its transformation into a modern nation, Australia has undergone profound changes over thousands of years. While the effects of colonization still reverberate in the lives of Indigenous Australians, the country continues to evolve and shape its future. Understanding Australia's history is key to understanding its present and the challenges it faces as it moves toward reconciliation and inclusivity for all its people.